Hi everybody, welcome to lecture 3 on the Greek world. Now, the Greek world was primarily marked by many influential factors. Three primary ones that we're going to talk about in this class are going to be philosophy, theater and storytelling, and sculpture. Other notable areas that are marked by the Greek world are politics, architecture, art, and history. But it's these three listed here that are going to be some of the more primary factors that really contribute to the Western world and are looked back on when we think about the Greek world as being significantly Greek in stature. Now, Greece is located in the southern part of the European continent, on the bottom of the kind of Balkan Peninsula. And it's important to note that during this time, the Greek world was not a unified Greece. It was more of different city-states that all kind of acted individually. And it's through these individual city-states that you would see different factions fighting together or fighting against one another. And only in very certain instances would they come together and really pull together to fight against a foreign entity, such as in the Persian War. Now, prior to the Greek world, we get this kind of Bronze Age in the region of the Aegean Sea, in which the seafaring cultures really took hold of these Aegean islands. So Greece is primarily made up of many, many different islands, and they all are a part of this kind of culture within the Aegean. And Greeks consider this to be kind of their prehistory and their world in terms of where they came from and the peoples that developed into the Greeks. It's interesting to note that the word that the Greeks used for this kind of a prehistory, for this Bronze Age, was known as archaeologia, or knowing the past. And so we can see where archaeology kind of comes from this Greek root, this Greek word, to really explain kind of the prehistory of peoples. And it's with the Greeks actually setting sail and settling on the different islands within the Aegean, creating these different city-states that were often very isolated from one another. They were very rural islands, and because of that isolation, you would often see wars going on between different islands for different resources or seafaring lanes or resources. But it was within this kind of entirety of the Greek islands that we kind of have a very similar culture, a similar culture that's really rooted in the gods of the Greeks and this kind of pantheon that's representation of all of the gods. Because for the Greeks, religion was a part of almost every aspect of their everyday life. Um, Religion helped them understand sin. It helped them understand pride, right and wrong, perceiving what was in favor of the gods versus not in favor of the gods. And so with Greek religion, it's very much a polytheistic religion where there are multiple gods, and these gods are susceptible and human-like, in instance, where they feel the things that we feel. So these gods are susceptible to things like desire, to jealousy, to capriciousness. And often these gods will kind of fight with one another. And so there's a kind of a butting of heads, a kind of tug of war between appealing to certain gods at certain times and not appealing to other gods at certain times, and trying to balance this polytheistic religion. And so it was with Aristotle, one of the famous Greek philosophers, who really pursued a kind of way to behave, a way to conduct behavior. And it was rooted in this idea of eudaimonia, or happiness, or human flourishing. We can define it as. There's no real good definition in the English language for it. And it's this idea of eudaimonia that really acts as a kind of stomping ground, or a kind of starting point for Aristotle's ethics and his virtue ethics, and how we should behave and conduct ourselves in the world, believing that our ultimate aim is for the good life to flourish, for happiness, and not happiness necessarily in terms of just like being happy because I'm on a jet ski, but instead the idea that I'm doing the right action in the right way at the right time in the right manner, making sure that everything is just being done in the proper way, avoiding extremes or deficiencies, and just doing what he kind of referred to as this kind of act in the golden mean, act in the middle way, in the middle path. And so Athens was the center of this kind of Greek world in the 4th and 5th century. This is where philosophy and politics really ended up taking root in terms of a full-fledged democracy, and not necessarily a republic like we might have in the United States now. And even though there are these different isolated communities, within Athens, you have this kind of urban center surrounding the kind of a citadel, which is the Acropolis, that's pictured here in the picture. Also, at the top of the Acropolis, the Pantheon, the temple, later turned into a church, turned into a mosque, turned into a military outpost. And so this is going to be the center of the city, where most business was conducted and people gathered. And so within Athens during this time, we see the rise of the Golden Age. And the Golden Age in Athens really produced this kind of a level of philosophy, this thought-provoking understanding of the world, or attempt to understand the world. It's where we see Socrates and Plato and Aristotle come from. And it was Socrates who was this philosopher essentially sentenced to death because of corrupting the youth, and because of essentially being said to believe in new or different gods from what the Greek people originally believed in, and was essentially made to drink hemlock, poison that would kill him, and he did so. But it's with Socrates that we really see a creation of this kind of philosophical movement. It's before Socrates, the philosophers that come before Socrates, known as the pre-Socratics. And the reason they're the pre-Socratics is because there is this distinction that's made between philosophers prior to Socrates and those after. And those who come after really take up this mantle of thought and inquiry into the world, into ethics, into knowledge. And so Socrates becomes that fundamental character within the golden age of philosophy. And with the pre-Socratics, these philosophers that came before Socrates, their chief concern was essentially with describing the natural world, what the world was made out of, how the world existed. Philosophers like Epicurus and Pythagoras, philosophers that claimed the world was always in motion, the first kind of instincts to what an atom was, and that these little atoms moving around made up the world. And that shifted to these to this group known as the Sophists, who were essentially the teachers, the wise men of the time, those that would often travel around and be paid for lessons, who instead of necessarily questioned the reality or existence of the world, moved into a different branch of philosophy known as epistemology, and really were concerned with how we know things, right? How is it that we know things? What does it mean to know something? And so the Sophists committed to a type of humanism, which focuses more on the actions of humans rather than kind of the makeup or measure of humans. And for Socrates, understanding the true meaning of things was just kind of a prerequisite for virtuousness or for acting virtuously. Socrates was one who would come down to the markets and often questioned sophists about the things that they knew, and would get involved in what is known as the Socratic method, which we talk about as a dialectic method of kind of question and answering, where he would begin to ask questions to the sophists about the things that they claimed to know, and get them to kind of circle back on what they had said earlier or contradict what they had said earlier, essentially using different types of reasoning and argumentation to show that the things that they were expressing they knew or claiming that they knew were things that they really didn't. And so Socrates is this philosopher that nobody really liked to talk to, right? Especially when it came to the sophists, because he would always express these arguments that led to contradictions, showing one to be false, but gave him this kind of reputation and created this sense of philosophy that we still use today, this dialectic method of really trying to understand a point by asking questions and seeing where it points and trying to find out whether or not there are contradictions that come up within a specific argument. And for particular universal truths, for Socrates, it was possible to understand the ideals to which human endeavors should aspire, but at the same time, Socrates is primarily known for one of his sentiments that the only thing that he knows is that he doesn't know anything. And so it's Socrates that goes around trying to learn about the world by asking these sophists, these teachers, these wise men, and not getting adequate answers, but in the process showing them to be foolish for what they think they know. And it's with Socrates that he's doing this that different students of his or followers of the sophists will see Socrates going through this dialectic method, questioning what the sophists know. And these students who are watching this happen end up start flocking towards Socrates, and Socrates becomes this teacher, this guide for how to philosophize or what to know. And of Socrates' students, his perhaps most famous student is Plato. And it's Plato who really writes down all of the things that we really know about Socrates. Socrates didn't write any of his own works. However, a lot of Plato's earlier works use Socrates as a character to express the type of philosophies or type of questions and situations that Socrates gets himself into with these sophists. So, while Socrates and Plato had much in common, as Plato's career starts to progress, he starts to kind of branch off and create his own sense of philosophy. And Plato's philosophy centers around a form of what we refer to as idealism, right? He seeks kind of an eternal perfection of pure ideas. And so with Plato, we often hear of the theory of forms, that everything has a ultimate and perfect form. So when we think of a tree, there is lots of different trees, but there is a perfect form of tree. There is a treeness, or there is a squirrelness. There is that perfect of everything out there. And this is the real world. And he expresses that through an allegory of his, known as the allegory of the cave. And it's kind of depicted in this picture here, where prisoners are chained up against a wall and only see shadows. And so these shadows become their reality, all that they know, these two-dimensional black images on the wall. And it's only when one of them is set free or escapes from his bonds that he's able to see that these shadows on the wall are just that, shadows that are being projected by people carrying objects behind them, which is being projected by a fire behind that. This prisoner is able to escape, come out of the cave and into the world and see the sun. And this is to help us understand our journey through understanding the world and knowledge, and getting to that form of idealism. Because what we see now could just be those shadows on the wall. And it's when we finally end up seeing what they are that our whole world is transformed. So we think of instances, for instance, when we're a child and then we believe in Santa Claus, for instance, and we think that this is reality, that Santa is this person that comes down our chimney at night and delivers presents on Christmas, only to realize later, when we see the light, when we escape the bonds of this kind of fake reality, that we see what the world really is. And for Plato, the world in which we're experiencing is just that, the shadows on the wall, and it is up to us to kind of claw our way out to really understand the idealistic nature of the world. And so through stories of Plato, and also fictional or mythical stories, not necessarily fictional, but more mythical stories of the writer Homer, that we start to see a kind of moral and behavioral way in which people in the Greek world try to live by, a sense of trying to be a specific type of Greek or be a specific type of person. We see this in adventures in the Iliad and Odyssey, and we see it within certain paintings or sculptures or pottery. We can see here depicted of the Greek soldier and what it means to be a Greek soldier and what it means to be a Greek. And this is a driving force for behavior in the Greek world. And going back to Aristotle, who is Plato's most famous student, Aristotle incorporates one of the most important ideas in Greek history, which is this kind of cleansing and purification of the soul, in which we often, in our expressions of plays or stories, we kind of start to see this empathy, this emotion, this catharsisness of what it means to be a Greek, what it means to act in a way that the Greeks are. And in addition to these type of Homeric epics, in types of in addition to the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, we see theater taking up a very big role within the Greek world, and really kind of, again, expressing this idea of how the Greeks should be or how the Greeks are, or looking at history. And one of the types of theatrical plays that exist are satire plays, comedy plays, in which the Greek comedy really kind of creates this kind of amusing and lighthearted design to make the audience laugh. Obviously, comedy movies, how we see them now, have this very specific role to play. And in Greece, this is really comes to life and really becomes a kind of aspect of Greek culture, this satire, these comedies. And we essentially slander, we ridicule certain people, politicians, public figures within these comedies to kind of give that kind of lightheartedness. And we also even do it within the Greek world towards the gods. And it's done in an attempt in a somewhat flattering sense, but also, again, in this lighthearted way of ridicule and drawing out kind of contradictions or frustrations in order for us to kind of empathize with what's going on, the kind of the fallibleness of humans and gods alike. Another area of theatrical performance were the tragedies that come out of Greek history in this time period. And just like with comedy, the basis for tragedy is conflict, and the traditional role of having a chorus, being an intermediary between actors and audience, trying to comment, narrate certain aspects to guide the audience in and out of different scenes and so forth, really kind of creates this kind of this sad and terrible scenes that we see in different tragedies, ranging from stories like Romeo and Juliet, for instance, which obviously comes well after the Greek world, but is one classic example of a tragedy. And so when we think of these tragedies, it's often explore the physical and moral depths to which human life can descend. So again, really trying to pull the audience into their kind of deepest and darkest worries and fears, in which case the protagonist might have a conflict of opposing will with the antagonist. You might have this kind of butting of heads, or this a situation in which you can't get the protagonist out of a situation or dig the protagonist out of a hole, just like we might feel in our world and our inner thoughts and emotions, like we can't get out. And so this level of empathy and seeing these characters on stage perform these scenes really takes us to a part within ourselves. And so we see this influential aspect of Greek history really lasting and being a major part of modern and contemporary history. And what we do now, we often use these movies and television shows to really explore our own thoughts and feelings about certain situations, to get us into certain moods, and really kind of ignite something in us that we can often either relate to or escape into, which was something that was promoted heavily within the. So it was the end of the day. Typically, you'd have an entire day of these plays that we would end with a kind of satirical play. These kind of farces that are satirical, where actors disguise themselves as satires, kind of creating this kind of lightheartedness ending to the day, to really get the audience out of the mood of these kind of terrible tragedies, or feeling this deep, dark feeling of seeing these tragedies, and kind of bring up the audience. And it's with Aeschylus, one of the founders, right, or perhaps notably a founder of tragedy, that really expanded the role of the chorus within these types of tragedies. And so he was a kind of master of visual presentation and known for costume design. In addition to another famous and influential playwright of the time, Sophocles, wrote many different plays, only a few of which survive, and perhaps one of the most notable is Oedipus the King. And so it's within some of Sophocles' plays that he really highlights different kind of gender differences that, again, we still see creep up in movies and television. And then the last of the playwrights that we're going to discuss, Euripides, was perhaps the youngest of the three that we're going to look at, and many of his plays actually survive. And he perhaps is one of the more controversial playwrights, where many of his plays would actually anger a lot of the conservative Athenians at the time. And so, moving from this golden age of Greek history into the kind of Hellenistic time period, there is this kind of growing tendency in Greek culture to value emotional expression much more than the balanced harmonies of classical art. And so this kind of philosophy of Aristotle, who challenged the idealism of Plato, really becomes this kind of theme for a little while during the Hellenistic Age, but will eventually be forgotten. And it won't be until later, during medieval times, that we see Europeans start to kind of come back to this Aristotelian philosophy and this kind of pull away from Plato's idealism. And one of the things that led to Aristotle's philosophy being spread around the world was the empire created by Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great was one of Aristotle's students, and it was his conquests which saw the defeat of the Persians and allowed Alexander the Great to really spread his rule through Asia to North Africa, Southern Europe, and take over most of the known world at the time. And it's through here that we see a lot of Aristotle's philosophies make their way into the Middle Eastern parts of the world. And so when Europe kind of slowly forgets about Aristotle's work, does not survive throughout history. And it's only through lecture notes of a cousin that we really see writings of Aristotle survive. It's through the medieval times, right, through the Middle Ages, that we really start to see European philosophers traveling through the Middle East, picking up these Aristotelian principles or these Aristotelian ideas, and see how kind of Aristotle saw behavior, this sense of eudaimonia and human flourishing, that we start to see his philosophies kind of make a comeback. But Alexander the Great takes over, conquers most of the known world, and it's through this time period, this late classic period, that we see a kind of change from kind of classical to the Hellenistic. And this is reflected in the images of men and women in quite kind of contemplative moods, very unemotional, apathetic, kind of stoic in a sense. And we see this in sculptures of the time period. And it's through other kind of famous Hellenistic sculptures of Lysippus, really kind of challenging the classical canon of proportion by creating sculptures with smaller heads and slender bodies. And we see this kind of thing in different forms here and now. We see a lot of illustration nowadays where we have this kind of proportion distribution, where we might see nowadays, we see bigger heads with bigger eyes, that kind of create a different sense. And so during this time of the kind of Hellenistic period, we see sculptures more kind of animated. We see them amidst action or doing something, contemplating or fighting or just being in action altogether. We also see kind of more sensuous sculptures, Athenian sculptures in which we have nude depictions of people, women and men. And here, again, this kind of remained the go-to way of sculpting, the standard throughout antiquity. And so it's going back to Aristotle and his observations of the natural world, kind of believing that one could come to know universal truths, that we can obtain universal truths through this type of empirical investigation. And so for Aristotle, philosophizing was all about knowing the world through experience, empirically, through testing, through science. Aristotle becomes one of the first and most prominent kind of scientific philosophers. And so not quite necessarily the scientific method created by Aristotle. This is what he alludes to. This is what he does prior to that really becoming part of how the world is going to develop. And so after this time of the Golden Age and into the Hellenistic time, Alexander's empire is essentially, after his rule, divided into three successor states. We get Macedonia or Greece, we get Egypt and Syria and Iraq, and the kind of our modern understandings of these specific places in the world. And then the kind of fourth kingdom of Turkey kind of becomes the more epicenter of Hellenistic culture. It essentially marks the end of this Greek Golden Age.